Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Merlin Reviews. Today we shall be taking a look at the most popular character of Marvel Comics, my favorite superhero, Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man. Specifically, we will be looking at the best known version of the character, the version from the main Marvel Universe, or Earth 616. Peter was born in Queens, New York, to two CIA operatives, Richard and Mary. However, following their deaths on a secret mission at the hands of the Red Skull, an orphan Peter was raised by his Uncle Ben and Aunt May. As Peter reached adolescence, he gained a brilliant scientific mind, but his shy nature and high grades made him an obvious target for bullies, often suffering much ridicule. At the age of 15, while attending a field trip to a science exhibit, Peter was bitten by a spider which had absorbed a severe amount of radiation. This mutated Peter's DNA, giving him abilities associated with that of a spider, including superhuman strength, reflexes, and a sixth sense to detect danger, a spider sense if you will. At first, these abilities inflate Peter's ego, and he even took it upon himself to enter professional wrestling under the identity of the Spider-Man. With stardom going to his head, Peter failed to stop a robber, simply claiming that it wasn't his problem. As fate would have it, this same robber would later go on to murder his Uncle Ben, his loving father figure. Learning from this tragic mistake, Peter decided to take on his uncle's mantra that with great power comes great responsibility. It was then that Spider-Man was truly born. As Peter grew and matured, his personality behind the mask would act as a means for him to deal with the often perilous trials he often faced. This is why Pete cracks joke all the time as Spider-Man. Much like any normal person, humor can be a great way to combat adversity. It also tends to throw off the concentration of his villains. Right from the get-go, Peter would struggle to find money to support his aunt after Uncle Ben's passing, even trying to work for the Fantastic Four. His longest term of employment, though, would be with the Daily Bugle, being a freelance photographer due to his surprising ability to gain pictures of Spider-Man. Ironically, these were often used as headlines by the head of the news agency, J. Jonah Jameson, who often spun the stories to suggest Spider-Man was a menace, creating the common theme of many stories. Spider-Man would eventually become Marvel's flagship character, essentially their Batman, being arguably the greatest superhero in his universe. His adventures would lead him to team up with, or even fight against, virtually every hero and villain in the world at some point. His rogues gallery is one of the biggest and most dangerous of all time in comic book history, including the legendary Sinister Six. His adventures would lead him to save the world and even the universe at times. But perhaps most evident among most heroes, Spider-Man's life is rife with tragedy, that which he often blames himself for. Next to the death of Uncle Ben, the main center of angst for Peter was the loss of his first love at the hands of the Green Goblin, Gwen Stacy. More on that later. Perhaps the best way to appreciate this character is his relation to the many people in his life. Firstly, there is Aunt May. Aunt May is basically Peter's mother figure. Many early stories, and quite a few modern ones, often created the basic dilemma in which Spider-Man is best known for, balancing his normal life with the secret one. Aunt May would often be in peril and Spider-Man would need to find a way to save her, without compromising his secret identity, also to save her. Ironically, that she would usually come across villains such as the Vulture or Venom, and even nearly marry Dr. Octopus. Yes, that was a thing. Usually Spider-Man may find himself in some serious peril, and about to give up, when the thought of those he loves most in his life give him the strength he needs to overcome the odds. Aunt May is the most constant reminder of his mistake with Uncle Ben, with his need to take care of her as a means to make up for his mistake in the most basic way. As doting as she can be, she represents the simplest part of Peter, his childhood self before being bitten by the spider, a time in his life that he often wishes he could rewind the clock back to. The most prominent person in Peter's life, one more day notwithstanding, is his relationship with his one true love and ultimately his wife, Mary Jane Watson. Unlike Peter in his early years, Mary Jane was a party girl who lived an adventurous lifestyle, although she came from an abusive family. Both of them often use humor to counteract the harshness of their lives. Mary Jane also gives him an extra boost needed when he's feeling particularly depressed, in more ways than one I'd imagine. Mary Jane would also be attacked by many villains over the years, though she never used these experiences to back out of their relationship. She loves everything about Peter, and fully supports his need for a superhero lifestyle. In regards to the tragic aspect of Pete's life, we cannot discuss this character without discussing his arch-nemesis, Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin. The Goblin represents how personal the dangers are for Spider-Man in comparison to most heroes. Many of his worst villains know who he is and use that against him. Norman was an industrialist and father of his best friend Harry. Upon use of a sci-fi type formula, he began to go insane and attempted to build a criminal empire. After many defeats by Spidey, he simply decided to follow the hero home one day. Eventually, this led to the death of Gwen Stacy, with the Goblin throwing her off a bridge and Spidey's attempt to save her with his web shooter, leading to her cracking her neck. Osborn was believed to be dead, but his legacy would continue to haunt Peter, with his equipment being used by the Hobgoblin, an individual who would become one of Spider-Man's most elusive and dangerous enemies, dominating storylines for nearly a decade. Worst of all, it would spawn many imitators, most notably Harry, whose drug addiction would ultimately make him more susceptible to such stressors. He became obsessed with gaining revenge, attacking Peter and his loved ones at every turn, forcing Peter to face his closest friend as one of his most vicious enemies. Worst of all, perhaps, Norman Osborn would eventually be revealed to have survived and manipulated the events of the infamous Clone Saga, forcing Peter to question his very identity and even arranging the death of Peter's newborn child. Yeah, Spider-Man does go pretty dark sometimes. Take that, Batman. Speaking of which, much like Batman and the Joker, those two would be representative of the ideals of good and evil and would continue their battle, even involving the powers of Asgard at one point. Their hatred for each other would grow into truly epic proportions. On top of beating himself up every time an innocent dies, Spider-Man seems to get flack from those he protects. While this is mostly due to the slandering by the Bugle, it is something which causes Peter to question the validity of his duties, having sworn off the mask several times. While not as bad as the X-Men or the Hulk, Spidey does suffer persecution from the world he protects. A common theme in Marvel, suggesting that greatest heroes don't make sacrifices for glory or appreciation, but because it is simply necessary. Despite being a loner by nature, Spider-Man is probably the most liked among the superheroes, at least within the superhero community. Becoming a staple of the Avengers, aiding the X-Men, and having a great respect for Mr. Fantastic and Bruce Banner. His closest relationships, though, are probably with the street-level characters such as Luke Cage, Iron Fist, the Prowler, and most notably Daredevil. After a common friend, a police officer named Jean DeWolf, was murdered, the two heroes clashed on how to deal with the situation. This would lead to a rather close friendship over the years. Though technically not the most powerful hero in Marvel, he's still unofficially the most powerful, much in the same way Batman is in DC, with his ingenuity and diverse power set allowing him to defeat almost any foe, while still being susceptible to a great deal of danger. If he can't physically defeat a foe, he can usually outsmart them or invent some gadget to gain the edge. In regards to his popularity, Peter Parker is probably the most relatable hero in Marvel, or at least he was originally. When he was originally created, superheroes were always adults, and larger-than-life paragons of infallibility at that. Peter was the first comic book hero to be a kid, and even more so a shy, emotional teenager who could make mistakes. Considering the demographic of comic book readers, especially back in the 60s, many were probably young kids who wished to be superheroes to give them some levity from being picked on at school or just feeling out of place. Peter Parker was a hero that many could truly see themselves being, a character who seems like an actual person who gained these abilities. He had trouble balancing school with work, he had trouble with bills, confidence on getting dates, and figuring out basically who he was. Throw in the tragic death of his uncle and some supervillains, it's a rather interesting story. Peter also was the first hero to actually grow and change over the decades, much like a real person, albeit much slower. There is also, of course, his strength against adversity, his sense of humor, and a very unique look and power set. Now, since this is an analysis, I do briefly want to cover some flaws that the character has. In truth, the angsty nature of Peter can get pretty grating at times, especially as he's supposed to be getting older, yet still seems to retain such adolescent qualities. This can make some storylines rather difficult to get through, leading to some often eye-rolling dialogue. This really is the character's one and only real major flaw. He doesn't ever seem to fully grow up. Even after marriage and several careers, a character pushing 30 is still acting 15 can get a little annoying at times, especially for longtime readers. It's gotten to the point where Spidey will monologue on how a cat getting hit by a car 3 cities away is somehow his fault. It's just kind of silly. Though to be fair, this is one of the issues with superhero comics in general, in that they are basically long-lasting serials. The characters will probably always be in some stasis somewhere before they can ever reach final development. Essentially, due to the nature of the medium, these characters can never really reach the full conclusion of their stories, at least not for long. This just seems to be more noticeable with Spider-Man, sadly. Still, his enduring popularity has left plenty of evidence to suggest why he is so beloved. Spider-Man has been, and still is, my favorite comic book superhero, with Batman as a close second. I just grew up loving Spider-Man as a kid and never stopped enjoying his stories. In truth, I related to the nerdy kid with the lack of confidence and family trouble, and I loved the retro sci-fi aspect of the character and many of his villains. Overall, Spider-Man is the staple of comic books, and one of the greatest superheroes ever created. Alright guys, those are my thoughts on Spidey. What do you guys think of Old Webhead? Let me know in the comments below. Alright guys, stay magical my friends.